Thanks for joining us. This is Gift to the Gulf, Wonders of the Gulf, the first of 4 sessions at this time daily over the next 4 days. We're going to be showing you the wonders of the Hauraki Gulf and looking at how we might restore her to her former beauty. We've got speakers from all kinds of walks of life coming to us, including an exciting pairing for you this morning. Just to say that I'm Andy Kenworthy from the Sustainable Business Network. SBN's work in the Gulf focuses on business engagement to restore the mauri, the life-giving essence of Tikapa Moana to Moananui-a-Toi. This project has received funding from Gulf Innovation Fund Together Gift, a Foundation North initiative. Thanks very much to them for making this possible, and thanks also to Auckland Council, who have made this particular event possible for us. As I say, this is the first of 4 sessions, so make sure you sign up to all. And over the next 4 days, we will be looking at restoring the Gulf and getting plastics out of the Gulf, and how our transport choices affect and impact the Gulf. They're the kind of main themes over the next 3 days. But today's session is, as I've said, the wonders of the Gulf. We will seek to reveal the true majesty of these waters and take a deeper, closer look at the waters and what we can do to restore them and the actions we can take. Across all the events, we'll also just be taking a real focus on personal responses to the Gulf and how we kind of connect and interconnect with the Gulf on our doorstep. And I'll be talking to all the speakers about that. Remember, there's prizes to be won throughout the sessions. You can take a pledge to help restore the Gulf at sustainable.org.nz, gifts-to the Gulf. Look that up on our website and see what you can do there. That gives you a rundown of various different actions you can take, from the very, very simple up to the quite dramatic. Every little bit helps, and it'll give you a little bit of a rundown as well of some of the issues that are facing the Gulf, which you'll also hear about here. Anybody taking the pledge there will be in to win a zilch weekend free EV car hire, and also Lewis Road creamy ice cream. And we've chosen those prizes partly as well to help out people in our SBN directory who are doing good work for us, and also some of these prizes also reflect on some of the actions you can take. For instance, choosing EV vehicles or choosing more ethically produced products than you normally may do. If you register and attend all 4 sessions, you can also be in to win a double pass on the Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari, so you can get out there yourself and experience the Gulf and the wonders that lie therein. And today's special prize is a Fuller's family pass to Tiritiri Mātangi. I've been there myself. It's unbelievable. And that will be selected from all the people who post their favourite Gulf moment on our Facebook live feed. We're live on Facebook right now, so you can dial in there, chuck in your magic moment. What was that time when you were a kid, jumping off wharfs, or whatever it is that connects you to the Gulf and makes it special for you. So in our first session, we're joined by James Frankham, who is the publishing director of New Zealand Geographic, and Chlöe Swarbrick, who needs very little introduction as the newly elected MP for Auckland Central. And we'll be looking at the perspectives that they offer on the Gulf. We've given them each 8 minutes to put forward their own unique perspective on the Gulf, after which there'll be a panel discussion where we'll get a little bit in depth. And you can also chuck your questions onto the Facebook feed and onto the Q&A feed here on the Zoom for us to put to our speakers. The more the merrier on that. And if you can keep them brief, that's great, because it makes it easier for me to read them, make sense of them, and get them in front of our speakers. Thank you, James. Thank you so much for joining us. I will let you lead off and give us your perspective on the Gulf.
Kia ora koutou. Hope everybody can hear me okay. As Andy mentioned, the publisher of New Zealand Geographic, but also have been a lover of the Hauraki Gulf all my life. Sort of grew up with salt in my hair and sand in my face, and down the bottom end of Waiheke in a little place called Silver Bay, and that's where I spent essentially every summer of my life. We would have days when the water would just turn black through the bay with bait fish coming into the bay, and then the kahawai coming in over the top, and then there would just be raining with white-fronted terns diving into the bay. We would hand feed stingrays from the waters. They used to quite like boiled eggs for some reason, and every now and again you get an orca come into the bay, and the first thing you'd see is all the stingrays coming fluttering up into the sand as the orca came through feeding. So we sort of grew up with that, and at any given moment, you know, anywhere up and down the Hauraki Gulf, you could see birds working, as it was called, you know, huge congregations of white-fronted terns and gannets just pounding into the water at any moment. Of course, the stories that my father had were sort of more extravagant than that, and the stories that his father had were more incredible again. So we've sort of seen a decline, but one of the things that I wanted to start out by saying is that the Hauraki Gulf really was certainly one of the great ecosystems on the planet. You know, we are talking about the Great Barrier Reef, we're talking about Yellowstone National Park, we're talking about the boreal forest. You know, the Hauraki Gulf was up there with one of the most incredibly powerful ecosystems on the planet. And we've seen that over the past 100 years begin to wither away. And as Dan Hikaroa is sort of intent on very often saying, it's about, you know, looking at the mauri of the Gulf and seeing that diminish rather than, you know, increase over time. So we're seeing a diminishment of that. And what that has looked like from sort of we imagine 100% abundance of fish life and bird life and shellfish and that sort of thing in the Hauraki Gulf maybe 150 years ago. We're seeing that at around about 20% of that natural abundance today. So there's been a very dramatic change. We're talking about an 80% decrease in most species. Crayfish are functionally extinct from the Hauraki Gulf, which means there is not enough for them to breed and survive. Tarakihi, flounder, trevally, they're all in trouble. Most of the seabed birds are threatened. We have mussels and other shellfish that are down around 1 or 2% of their previous level, which is a massive decline. A lot of that happened in the 60s. There's only about 4 of the most commonly caught finfish species in the Hauraki Gulf are at sustainable levels. The rest are either data deficient, we just don't know, or they are sort of on the brink and okay. Things like kahawai are okay. Kingfish, we believe, are okay. Others are right on the edge. Snapper are below sustainable levels and we're still catching them. Tarakihi, trevally, really, really threatened. It used to be that you could go out to the Gulf, just out here through my window, and you would see trevally feeding on the surface that literally covered football fields, acres and acres and acres. And now you go out there and you get excited when they cover, you know, 20 square meters or something. And so we've seen a very a massive decline. There are a lot of reasons for that, and I'll go into that in a moment, and albeit briefly. But I thought it might be worth, I'm going to have a crack here, committing presenter suicide by sharing my screen and see what we can see. So I'm going to jump into a couple of videos. We've been involved for the last couple of years in a program called the NZVR project, which seeks to connect the public with the Hauraki Gulf and see below that mirror surface of the sea. So what we're seeing here is what it looks like at Goat Island, which is a very small marine protected area up on the lee coast, on the fringes of the Great Barrier, of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park. What you're seeing, of course, is close to natural abundance levels of snapper. This is not a large amount of snapper. This is close to natural abundance. We're also seeing kelp covering a rocky reef structure. And again, this is very natural sort of levels of these predators and this weed. So if I take you from here to just down the coast a fraction, probably maybe 10 kilometers away, a place called Nordic Reef. And this is what it looks like at Nordic Reef. So it's a very different scene. I'm going to pull up the volume on this. I trust that's coming through. That sound that you can hear is kina munching away at the rock and at the turfing algae and at the coralline algae. So the brown stuff that you can see is actually coralline algae and turfing algae that is formed over the rock structures. But what you can't see is any weed of any sort. You might be able to see the odd fish. There are still fish there. Fish actually don't do too badly on a reef structure like this, but the numbers of them are much, much lower than you would see inside a marine protected area. So this is at Nordic Reef, very close to that original shot that we had of the Lee Marine Reserve. You can still pull up snapper from places like this because snapper eat kinna, and so it still feels like it is a functioning ecosystem, but put your head underwater and it looks very, very different. So probably about 500 or 600 meters away from that is up in the harbour here. This is up in Lee. So you'll see under the reef there's a bit of rubbish. The water's murkier, but there's still fish around. If you look very closely, you can see an octopus poke its head up and out of the spare tire that's been tossed over the side of the reef. This is sort of typical of our harbour ecosystems now. You're seeing a bit of sediment there. Out in open water, of course, we're still seeing plenty of dolphins, this sort of thing. So this is common dolphins, of course. This was filmed with a VR camera over the bow of the boat. So there's parts of the Gulf that are still very much in a pristine sort of form. And then coming right up into the city itself, this is under the wharves of the viaduct, and you can see there these fan-like sort of structures on the underside of the piles there. Those are all, sorry, I've got a lot of audio here. Those are all Sabella, which is an invasive species. So that's a bit of a tour, I suppose, of what the Gulf is looking like today. It's a wee bit shocking. I'm just going to show you also, we've also started a project called Seascape, where we are using photogrammetry to map the seabed in different parts of the Hauraki Gulf. And again, this has been a frightening process as we've gone through it. So this is a very long photographic map of the seabed up in Tiri. So you would expect it to have quite decent levels of life. You'll see here that it's a very barren landscape now. A little bit of weed over here, a bit of turfing algae, but really not a lot to be seen. This is what it looks like in most of the Hauraki Gulf now, and even as far north as the Mokohino Islands. And climate, of course, is having an effect there as well. Likewise, what we're seeing here is a picture of trophic collapse. And trophic collapse, very regrettably, is almost like a skyscraper where you have lots and lots of levels, and at each level it might represent, predator fish or mesopredators of the smaller fish, right down to the algae and the kina and things that rely on all of that sort of food chain, if you like. And when you start removing predators from that, whether it's crayfish or snapper or whatever, then you just start pulling apart parts of the structure until the whole building collapses, one level onto the next level, onto the next level. And you end up in a situation called trophic collapse, where the whole balance is upset. You're left with kinna barrens and sediment deserts, effectively. And not to put too fine a point on it, but that's what we're broadly seeing out in the Hauraki Gulf now. It is in catastrophic collapse. What's caused that? The very first thing is fishing. So that commercial fishing and recreational fishing. In the context of the Hauraki Gulf, those are equal influence. In fact, we take slightly more, recreational fishers take slightly more snapper from the Hauraki Gulf than commercial fishers do. So very broadly equal. And so, if you're wondering where the fish have gone from the Hauraki Gulf, we ate them. Same with the kinna, same with the crayfish rather, we ate them. Broadly, we're to blame. The other situation is, of course, sedimentation coming down our waterways from sources on land, whether it's developed sites and urban sources or rural sources of sediment and nutrients from waterways that are not fenced. or not planted out. So sedimentation is the other big effect. Climate is probably the third one. And then, as well as all of those extractive things, the things that we're taking too much of, we're also putting the wrong things back in. So yes, plastics is having an effect in the Hauraki Gulf and the New Zealand Territory Sea. It's less of an effect than fishing, if you like, but it's still having an effect. Pollutants, heavy metals coming from industry, and like I say, nutrients, runoff from urban sources and rural sources as well. So it's a litany of factors, and you know, all of them are contributing to the state of the Gulf at present. It's not in a terrific state. The things that are going to fix it, effectively, us taking less out of the Gulf, us putting less bad stuff back into the Hauraki Gulf. But the big ticket item that is going to make the biggest difference is marine protection, fundamentally. So that's my squib, that's my spiel. I'll get some questions after this, no doubt.
Thank you so much, James. That's fantastic. Yeah, and I mean, it is like a tragedy of generations, that we don't even know what we've lost a lot of the time, because we're used to jumping in the sea and not seeing much and thinking that's normal, and it's very, very far from normal. And
a lot of the destruction actually happened some time ago, and so some of the worst sedimentation was around the period of gold mining in the Coromandel. That's when most of the sedimentation in the Firth happened, and so the runoff from today's activities on land pales in comparison to what's coming, you know, what happened at that time, and also heavy metals at that time. Same thing with most of the shellfish were removed in the 1950s and 1960s. So it is intergenerational. This has happened over 150 years, but the important thing to know is that it's still happening today, and there are still destructive fishing methods being used.
Cool. We'll discuss that further later. And you know, changing marine protection for, you know, genuine marine protection, not just paper, not just on paper, but actually out there.
Yeah, 100%. And that's, you know, the marine protection that works. Science is very, very clear on that. It's got to be no take.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. Well, let's bring in Chlöe Swarbrick, and she can put forward her perspectives and her unique ideas around what we might do from here. Obviously, she's got some political levers she may be able to pull. Chlöe, thank you so much for joining us.
Kia ora, there we are. I was hoping that was working. That news that I was just speaking about before, Ihoama has broken, so apologies if I look at my phone. But kia ora tātou te whānau. My name is Chlöe Swarbrick, and I am utterly privileged and stoked to be the brand new Auckland Central MP, of course, of the Greens. I have served over the past 3 years as a list MP, and now have the privilege of representing my home. Auckland Central is a fascinating electorate, and that it doesn't just include the city side, which it so often is characterised or even sometimes caricatured as, but extends throughout the Waitemata, encompassing the likes of the Waiheke Island and of Aotea Great Barrier. I will talk to you today as a bit of a layperson, to be perfectly honest. My background, despite being a staunch activist for the Waihekians amongst us, an activist and lunatic, very much for the protection of our ecological spaces, but I don't have any necessary expertise in that space. I've constantly sought to upskill myself by reading, by researching, and by leaning on those community leaders and experts in iwi and hapu, but also amongst those, and for example, the Hauraki Gulf Forum, which I'll speak to in a moment. But I also, of course, come to this kaupapa from the perspective of a legislator. So today I think it's probably quite worthwhile to walk through how we actually can go about enacting some of those changes which James so eloquently spoke to, but also to provide a bit of an understanding of the framework which we're currently grappling with and how we got to this place in time. So on that point, really important for me to elucidate that I think that we need to be moving when we're talking about the Hauraki, particularly because of the tipping points of kind of ecological collapse that James was alluding to, the kind of feedback loops that continue to perpetuate worse and worse outcomes, particularly for fishing stock, but also for the seabed, as we continue to allow sedimentation and dumping and otherwise to continue. We need to be shifting our focus here from one of merely sustainability, where we perhaps end up unintentionally locking in some pretty perverse outcomes, into one of regeneration. If we want to protect the Hauraki and return it to the mauri, which it has historically enjoyed, then we need to actively invest more into it than we are currently taking out of it. We don't just need to reach this kind of stasis. In fact, we need to be investing into it. So that's probably the first point, is moving to a space, a place, and a way of thinking about regeneration. So to that point, the primary piece of legislation which governs the Hauraki Gulf is known as the Hauraki Gulf Marine Parks Act 2000. We're now obviously speaking about the Hauraki 20 years on from that. To give you a bit of a physical manifestation or example of just how long we've been discussing this whilst the Hauraki has been in decline. The Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act 2000 came into effect when I was 6 years old. I'm now obviously, I'm 26, but I'm also a member of Parliament. So I am the very physical manifestation of the amount of time that we've been talking about this and not taking anywhere near enough action to protect and actively restore the mauri of the marine park. So within the Marine Park Act 2000, within section 3, you'll find some really interesting purpose statements, which refer to the purpose of the Act to integrate the management of the natural, historic and physical resources of the Hauraki Gulf, its islands and catchments, to establish the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park, to establish objectives for the management of the Hauraki Gulf, its islands and catchments, to recognise the historic, traditional, cultural and spiritual relationship of the tangata whenua with the Hauraki Gulf and its islands, and to establish the Hauraki Gulf Forum. Now I'll touch back and unpick a number of these as I progress through the few minutes that have been allotted to me. But I think it's probably really important to highlight first and foremost that there are actually 3 kind of districts that are all encapsulated by the Hauraki Gulf. The primary one, the perspective from which we're speaking today primarily, is that of the broader Auckland super city, which meant that there were kind of amendments made to this act in 2010. But also you've got Thames Coromandel, and you also have the Hauraki District 2. But on top of that, you have 28 different iwi and hapu that are implicated in terms of their claim to this moana. And on top of that, 19 of those 28 iwi and hapu are within the broader Tāmaki Makaurau side. So the really interesting part about this act, and why perhaps it hasn't been operating as well as it arguably could have been, is when you go to within part 1 of the act with management of the Hauraki Gulf, what you'll find in section 8 is management and how that is supposed to be managed, all with relation to the Resource Management Act 1991. And what you'll find is constant reference to the protection and, where appropriate, the enhancement of the life supporting capacity of the environment of the Hauraki Gulf, its islands and catchments, basically repetition from that section 3 purpose statement, but the constant inclusion of the terminology where appropriate. And this is a classic issue that we find within legislation and regulations that are established to try and protect our environment, or actually arguably even sometimes our people, from exploitation, is this kind of caveat to enable discretion, which in turn enables wiggle room, which in turn means that lawmakers, regulators and otherwise have an out. But then you get to section 15. And section 15 is also quite interesting, and this is the point that I want to get to around how we actually progress from here. That's the beginning of part 2 of the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park Act 2000, and that outlines the purposes of the forum, the Hauraki Gulf Forum, and it essentially outlines the importance of integrating the management and conservation in a sustainable manner of the Hauraki Gulf, as well as as facilitating communication, cooperation, coordination on matters of statutory functions, and also to recognise the historic, traditional, cultural and spiritual relationship of tangata whenua within the Hauraki Gulf. Now, for those who have been accustomed to or looked through or been aware of, which I guess I can just state quite explicitly, the politics of the Hauraki Gulf Forum over the past 20 odd years, it has been challenging and terse at times. And one of the many reasons for that is, of course, that there are tensions, as James alluded to. There is the likes of kind of fishing and quotas. There is also settlements, but there also is the challenges of the tension between local regulations and where councils have a role to play, and then also where there are legislative functions, where the government has to come in. Now, here is where we get to the exciting part, which is that since the past local government elections, Waitemata has had the privilege of having an awesome councillor by the name of Pippa Coombe come in, who has taken the helm with Nicola in co-chairing the Hauraki Gulf Forum. And they have worked together with the broader forum to produce the latest report, which makes 4 quite strong recommendations, all of which, however, seem to have very strong public support behind them, therefore making them entirely achievable in the structural space. And just to start unpacking some of those, the first is to get to 30% protection of the Hauraki Gulf. Now, what's interesting about this is that I believe it was alluded to before, but only 0.3% of the Gulf is currently protected. It's nowhere near enough. Some say that this is politically untenable, but referring to my own personal experience, what we have seen is that the Greens campaigned on a protection of the of 30% of all of our oceans within our exclusive economic zone in this 2020 election, and found massive support, with, of course, making sure that there was that cultural literacy, I guess, to ensure that this wasn't then impeding on customary title. There also is currently, I believe, some proposals, some bins, which are briefing to incoming ministers, the likes of David Parker, who is the incoming Minister for Oceans, on how we can get to doing this. There is also a recommendation, the second, to look after our seafloor, particularly with regard to the restoration of shellfish beds, which are a really good way to monitor this. There is currently seed funding investment, but consents are required to get it through Biosecurity New Zealand. And from what I understand, that's been quite challenging for Auckland Council. There is also the need to stop really damaging practices within this protection of the sea floor. That is to stop particularly dredging. However, what you find when you look into, again, those levers that occur locally or regionally and at a central government level, what you find is that dredging is a locally regulated practice, whereas dumping is a centrally regulated practice. But they are effectively 2 sides of the same coin. So if we stop one, then we are able to stop the other. The third recommendation is around riparian planting, to stop stuff getting into the marine park in the first place. If we're able to think of this in the same way that we perhaps think of our built environment, if we think that as green infrastructure, then there's some awesome opportunities, particularly with the Green Jobs Fund that was set up by Eugenie Sage in the last government, in the last budget. And there is also, obviously, fourthly, the need to stop marine dumping. Now, here you end up with all kinds of quite confusing and therefore quite annoying situations where there is the opportunity, despite it technically being disallowed to dump within the marine park, that technically there is the ability to dump on the way to an official site. So you can do so by virtue of saying that it's something needed to be thrown overboard in the process, but there are 2 big projects presently that are underway, and they are the City Rail Link and the port. And from what I understand, there has recently definitively been dumping inside of the marine park on that technicality. We need to get rid of that technicality. So there is also the importance here of recognising the whakamā, the shame that different iwi have expressed to me as feeling about dumping in another's rohe. And that is again where it is so important that we integrate these co-governance ways of thinking about things. Just finally on this, I think there are some really great opportunities for us to obviously leverage off of where this consensus has been built inside of the Hauraki Gulf Forum, because it seems there is massive appetite to just get on with it. I am really stoked by the fact that Labour has appointed a Minister of Oceans and hope that indicates a direction of travel. I am writing to him in my capacity as the Auckland Central local MP, but have the staunch tautoko of former Minister of Conservation, Eugenie Sage, on this. But on top of that, I do know that there is an appetite to look at the Marine Park Act, particularly as it intersects with the Resource Management Act within the reforms that are underway right now. I'm sure that all of us who've been engaged in particularly the housing debate have heard time and again the wants to repeal and replace the RMA. Well, that is happening, and we need to make sure that we do it with our oceans and particularly the Hauraki Gulf in mind. So there, I would just say in summation that it is moving away from a quite westernized view of how we individually look at certain spaces within the Hauraki for effectively scientific kind of spaces being set aside to investigate, but in fact apply something which some have suggested to just effectively say, hey, the whole thing's a marine park and you need to, it's 100% protected, and you need to apply for spaces where you want it not to be protected, which is one potential way to approach the issue. But another is through real living tangata whenua, Pākehā co-governance, whereby we actively try and live out our Te Tiriti partnership through recognition of the customary tools to protect our sea floor, our seabeds, and the Hauraki Gulf as a whole. So I hope that that's given you some steer of where we're at, and looking forward to the kōrero and questions.
Sorry, I've got handlers in the background pressing buttons at the same time that I'm pressing buttons, and then I press a button and they press it off and they press it up. Anyway, thank you so much. That gives us a great summary of where we're headed, and that kind of needed tightening of structures and the grappling with the kind of various interests in the Gulf. It's good to see sort of real proposals coming forward, and probably hopefully backed with some serious money, which is always needed. I should declare an interest in terms of riparian planting. Of course, SBN runs the Million Metres Streams project, planting along the waterways all around the Gulf and all around the country. And we've also been facilitating around about 54 jobs through the Jobs for Nature program. So we're seeing the benefits of that as it flows through us into our partners to get some real action on the ground, which is fantastic to see. And of course, Chlöe fantastically busy because Parliament's just opened up. So there's all sorts of other stuff going on. And what I wanted to do was kind of bring us back to a discussion at this point. I should say also that Dan Hikaroa was due to join us. Unfortunately, he's been called away at the last moment. So best wishes to Dan, and we will attempt to dial him into one of our later sessions because we'd really like to get his input. So James, Chlöe, if I could bring you back in, what I'd like to sort of just throw around some ideas around what we do next. And I know it'd be good to get, James, maybe your response. I would imagine you know about a lot of those political developments. One of the things I've sort of noticed about yourself is, I don't know, there's an emotional connection for you, and there's a sense you're kind of almost at the end of your tether. How do you feel about where we're at now? Do you think we're seeing genuine shifts, or is it a sort of barrage of good intentions that we've sort of seen over the last 20 years?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Let me put it this way: I've got a lot of hope for what can happen out there. We can make change. We do have agency in fixing this problem. It is far from unreconcilable. We just to date haven't shown a willingness to do so. We will only sort of contribute on our own terms, if you know what I mean. We will be happy to participate in something as long as it benefits us, but will not do so if it impinges our rights in some way. It's been a very rights-based argument. And you can we can speak about commercial fishing, we can speak about dairy industry, we can speak about recreational fishing, we can speak about anybody anti-fouling their boat, we can speak, all of these things. And when you actually ask somebody to make a change, that's when the rubber meets the road. And we haven't been particularly constructive, but also I think the problem is that we haven't been very good at understanding or seeing what is actually happening out there. We're still catching fish. We think it looks sweet, and it really, really isn't. So if we consider the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park, now that extends beyond the Hauraki Gulf as such. It surrounds Great Barrier, out past the Moananui Islands, and as far south as the Mercury Bay, if you like. So it's a very, very large area. Within that area, we are still using destructive fishing methods. We are still bottom trawling, using Danish seining, and dredging the seafloor. We're allowed to do that. That's perfectly legal outside of what's called the trawl line, which bisects the Gulf. Commercial fishing is doing that. It is horrendously damaging, but recreational fishers are also doing it with scallop dredges. They're not as big, but there are thousands of them. So moving destructive fishing methods out of the Gulf is the first thing. Marine protection, proper no-take marine protection is another thing. And that is a hot button subject for most people who don't want something taken away from them. They see it as locking up resource, whereas in reality, marine protected areas are fish pumps. They're investment banks for the future, which broadcast that interest, if you like, the larvae from all of that fish and the eggs up to 40 kilometers out of every marine reserve. So they're a part of any modern fishery. We need to decrease our catch. We need to look at shellfish beds, although there are some technical problems with that we're still grappling with scientifically. We need to be planting and fencing. Million Meters project is a great example of that, but Million Meters project needs to scale to be effective. So we need more money and more planting. It needs to be 100 times larger if that is going to make a dent. And we need to reduce emissions, because fundamentally climate, as much as we sort of think that is something that happens in another part of the world, climate change is having a big effect here, largely in terms of the range of invasive species and in the warming waters and the ability and resilience of our own systems.
Fantastic. Chlöe, I was going to say, do you think, can you see the kind of selection of tools we're putting together now, and that kind of impetus as being able to grind over those times when it becomes difficult decisions that cost people money or restrict their rights? That's where it always sort of the rubber hits the road, eh? And how heartened are you by that in your own estimations?
Yeah, so I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, right? Which is that everything's nice to talk about, but when it comes to actually doing it, let alone collaborating to make it happen, things can become a bit more difficult because different interests come out to play, and then there's the constant question as who's going to pay for it and how are we actually going to do this, and that all comes down to what we value. So I really do want to emphasize that these are not wild out the gate ideas. They have been socialized relatively well, and the reception that I received in running on the 30% protection of all of our oceans, which is what's recommended by scientists when it particularly comes to reduction of things like ocean acidification, but also ensuring that we have greater fish stocks and otherwise. We have the mandate from the public to do that. So it ultimately comes down to continuing to make the noise about it, lest you end up with some of the special interests getting in the ear of government and regulators. And I effectively look at this as my classic way of attempting to unpack these issues is you've got the cultural side of things, and then you've got the structural side of things. So structure is legislation, regulation, funding, taxation, incentives, subsidies, contracts, treaties, etc. And there you're finding that there is a failing, particularly with regard to the discretion, the leniency, and the wiggle room that is provided. It is not tight enough. But then you've also got culture, and culture is all about practice. It's about conversation. It's about values, particularly a shared set of values, which enables groups of people who come from very different backgrounds, whether that is commercial fishers or recreational fishers or different iwi and hapu, noting that they are not in any way, shape or form homogenous unto themselves. And then you've got local government, and then you've got central government. If we are able to unify around those shared set of values and the things that we want to achieve, then you create an environment that is conducive to that structural change. But it will not happen without the fire staying on the feet of politicians. And I note that somebody has popped a question there about the need for a champion. And on this, I can say that I've done pretty good at being pretty annoying over the past 3 years on issues that I care very deeply about. And now with the mandate of being the MP for Auckland Central, alongside a raft of other issues that particularly impact the electorate, this is one that is very close to my heart, particularly as a Green. So you can absolutely anticipate that I'll be lobbing some questions to David Parker in the House on it, but also attempting to build up something like a pledge or otherwise. But if any NGOs out there are thinking about things that they can do, if there is any way that I can amplify your noise, then I'm all for it.
Fantastic. And you're doing that right now, which is awesome. And we'll hold you to that, definitely. The other thing is, on the technical one, is it possible to go through the Marine Protected Act and kind of tighten it all up? Is there a mechanism for doing that?
Yeah, you could totally do an amendment to it, and there is the potential to do that through the likes of a local bill, which could it might potentially require collaboration with the likes of Scott Simpson. But I would hope that with the RMA amendments that are being, or not even amendments, the complete scrapping and replacement of it, and the consideration of how we had a Resource Management Act, and now perhaps based on the recommendations of experts, we need a Building Act and we need resource management, that there are some real considerations on the flow-on effects with regard to the marine park legislation, because those two do interact. So I'm hoping to get some FaceTime with the Minister, David Parker, on this, and I'll let you know how I go.
Fantastic. I was going to touch on that. It's just interesting, the concept of resource management, and also, I mean, the ideas like green infrastructure. It's like, do we need a fundamental, I mean, we haven't got Dan here, unfortunately, which would be perfect for him, but do we need a fundamental shift in mindset away from seeing the water as a bunch of resources?
Yes,
how
we
much
do.
fish have we got? Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Absolutely.
How do we make that happen?
Yeah, so it's all built around this notion that everything is here as a utility for human beings, and that is a relatively arrogant suggestion at the best of times, rather than an ecosystem that we are in fact part of. And yes, these things, we might sort of value things for their commercial benefit to us, or whatever, or value them for tourism as a mechanism for creating more resource for conservation and things. But fundamentally, the ecosystem has intrinsic values in its own right, and those intrinsic values are embraced in that concept of mauri, and then are brought into the human world through this notion of mana whenua, mana moana, kaitiakitanga, and all the things that Dan Hikaroa could speak much better to than I would. But Māori also are in an invidious position as regards all of this in a broad sense. Iwi have across the board been awarded a fisheries quota as part of their settlement process. And so they are now drawn between the commercial requirements of maintaining quota, of handing the benefits of that down to iwi, hapu and families, and then their responsibilities as kaitiaki for these spaces. And that is an incredibly problematic space that iwi are grappling with at present.
Yeah, one of our questions online sort of looking at the idea of some sort of rahui across the Gulf,
yeah,
in the manner of the Kauri dieback disease, which is, I think, is a really good analogy, because it's that sense of, it's horrible to think I can't go and walk in the hills, but it needs to be done. Otherwise, something's nothing's going to change.
And there are a lot of mechanisms for marine protection other than through the Marine Reserves Act. So we've seen that in Mōtiti, around that area in the Bay of Plenty. That was not through the Marine Reserves Act, but through council under their responsibilities to manage and protect. There's Mataitai and Taipure type of customary take reserves, as well as the traditional marine reserves. So there's lots of ways that this can happen, and voluntary.
Yeah, I suppose I've got two thoughts of perhaps for Chlöe here. There's one about the just transitions, which I think is a really good. It's a fantastic model of, again, things that we can't go on doing, like deep sea oil drilling, but we need to find people's livings are there, people are working there. We need to find a way to shift. And the other one is just sort of sending signals. Like, is there an early shot across the bows we could look at, like the dredging line, to say you just can't do that anymore. Just to send that, like the deep sea oil thing, to say we're just drawing a line and saying we're changing direction here.
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely is an opportunity to phase this in, but also I think we constantly need to be aware that there is a spectrum when it comes to the notion of the just transition. I mean, the notion of the just transition was invented by NGOs, by Indigenous activists for climate justice, effectively. It was about recognizing that there's an opportunity to shift an economic model, to your earlier question, Andy, away from just thinking about how we exploit people in the planet into more of, I guess, Kate Raworth's kind of donut economics philosophy, thinking about how we ensure that everybody has what is necessary so that they then don't move to exploit somebody else or to exploit our shared natural resources. So fundamentally, we can't risk rebranding that into simply retention of the status quo, but greenwashed. So that is all about being really transparent about this process. And that is also about ensuring that there is genuine Indigenous leadership that the rest of us follow here, because had we continued with Indigenous practices, then we wouldn't have these issues to begin with. They're incredibly exploitative. I mean, one of the ways that it's been proposed to kind of phase this in, I believe, is even by the Hauraki Gulf Forum, who suggested that we could do, ultimately aiming for 30% protection, but get to 5% by 2022. And I understand that that's also currently on the desk of the minister in that briefing to incoming ministers. So I think that that's, obviously as a Green and as possibly, one of the many older end of the young people who have been marching in the streets demanding immediate action on environment and on climate. I'd like to go the whole hog almost immediately, but we do have to recognise that people's livelihoods are going to be challenged potentially. But again, I'd also refer to the fact that there are, particularly when you're talking about practices like dumping, it's actually something that can be built into bottom lines. It's something that can be priced for. The only reason that it's currently happening is by virtue of a technicality, and it's purely economic. So it needs to become uneconomic to keep damaging our shared environment. It seems really common sense, but things get incredibly convoluted when they come into a political space. And that's why I think that kind of clarity of integrity has to continue to be banged on about from the outside to really force politicians to look at themselves, because they unintentionally or intentionally make it far more complex, which means that they end up tying their own hands to make these decisions.
I think that's a general theme across sustainability, that we don't want to do the simple solutions, so we just make it really, really complicated and spend the whole time pushing our Brussels sprouts around the plate and refusing to eat them. Another sort of thing I was looking at was, James, have you got a sense of, the magic wand question, if you had, what would be the whole hog if you could suddenly do it overnight? What would the Gulf look like in your view?
You mean what would fix it all? That would be moving destructive fishing methods out of the Gulf and having 30% no-take marine protection in the Gulf. That would do it. We can still keep recreationally fishing in the Gulf, but we have to understand the ecosystem impacts of what is going on. So yeah, that's the fix-it scenario. You would also be looking at trying to fence and plant waterways, particularly in the Hauraki catchment, where you've got about 3,600 linear kilometres of waterways going through farmland that are not fenced. And that would be a good start too. But bringing it all back together, I suppose that one of the issues that we've had as a species, in this space is, and as a civilization, particularly Western civilization, is that we have managed somehow to divorce rights from responsibilities. We give one person rights to fish commercially, for instance, and another group responsibilities to regulate that, and they're not together. But wedding those two things, rights and responsibilities, into the same thing where the person who is taking from the environment has the responsibility to ensure they can keep taking from it in the future, that's called kaitiakitanga. It's very, very simple. We have the tools, we have the thought processes and the way of understanding this. We're just not practicing it. If we did, we'd be in a different space right now. So I'm very hopeful about the future. We just need to get on with it.
How are we tracking internationally? Because, there's a sense in New Zealand, we do a cracking job compared to others. I mean, how is this opposed to others,
we
city-states
used to
next
lead
to
the world. We used to lead the world in marine protection. We had the first marine reserves on the planet. We know how to do it. And right now we are trailing miles behind. We have 0.37% of our marine protected area and of our exclusive economic zone protected. Other countries have 20, 30, 40% up and below, for instance. So it can be done. We're just not doing it. And successive governments have failed to do this. We've had 8 years of national government, and I think 9 years of Labour government, and yet we're still sitting on that miserly figure. And there are a lot of very compelling reasons why that hasn't happened, political reasons, and largely around commercial fishing, but also around how the treaty has been used as a tool rather than for its original intent as a stalking horse, if you like, to avoid protection and to protect rights. But we need to move on from that. We need to grow up. We need to take back our leadership position in the world in terms of marine protected area. We have the fourth largest marine estate in the world, 4 million, square kilometers, and we're failing to protect it, and it's an embarrassment. As Chloe said, we've got to deal with the shame of this too.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, obviously that we're doing these this series of events not just for education or entertainment, but also to get people to do things and take action themselves. Can I just go to finish this off? Can we just sort of one thing that you would like people to take away and do when they switch this thing off? What they should do next?
You go.
Yeah, support marine protection. Be careful where what you shop for in terms of your fish, sending a message to those commercial fishers. And when you're out in the Gulf, enjoy it and be very, very aware of what you take and what you put back in.
Fantastic. Chloe?
Conversations change the world. I mean, if you want to think about how we socialize and how we normalize action on things, but also back to that kind of paradigm that I was talking about before around cultural change, which leads to structural change, creating a change in values or norms that we accept, which ultimately is conducive to structural change. That starts with every citizen in this country demanding nothing less than. So, I have been in Parliament now for the past 3 years, and ironically, I'm actually far less cynical than when I first came in. I have seen how quickly things can change. We have a population the size of Melbourne in this country. We have 2 degrees of separation. So go and have conversations with people and put this on the political agenda. You'll have myself and others fighting from the inside, but unless we continue to leverage this conversation up the kind of hierarchy of priorities, it's simply going to keep falling off the radar. So keep putting it on the agenda. And if you do have the capacity to take on further activism and advocacy, then do just that. Join something bigger than yourself. I know that there are a number of folks, particularly on Aotea Great Barrier and on Waiheke, who would love some support, whether you can do that with resource, or you can do that with, you know, turning up and helping with protests or otherwise.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much, Chlöe, for your time. I know on such a massively busy day, we'll all be looking through the news for where you'll pop up next. And James, thank you so much for your time also. It's amazing to see those images and dragging us down into the water. Stay with us for the next three days at the same time for more of these sessions. I should also say, do go on, take your pledge at sustainable.org.nz, gifts to the Gulf. And remember, you can win prizes by doing so. You can get a Zilch weekend free car EV hire or that ice cream. Fantastic. And thanks to our sponsors for those prizes. Remember, today's special prize is that Fuller's family pass to Tuaturi Mātangi for the best moments that you can recall and in the Gulf that we're collecting. And we're really doing that to collect, you know, we really want to connect the sense of what the Gulf is all about and see if we can share that, because part of it is about just how we feel about the Gulf. And if we keep it in mind, keep it connected like we would a loved one, then perhaps we'll start to treat her like a loved one. We'll be back tomorrow with the second installment, Restoring the Gulf, where we're going to take a closer look at some of the efforts to restore the Gulf and the people who are out there doing it, getting wet in the cold and doing that work for us, and hear how that we can expand and support their work. Thanks again to our sponsors, to Foundation North Gift Programme, and also to Auckland Council for making this possible. And thank you all for sharing your time with us. We'll see you tomorrow.